Welcome back to the IE427 garage, everybody. What I'd like to do today is a little bit of tool info. A while back, while we were doing the wiring on the King's Cobra, I put a question out and I asked everybody if they would be interested in the tools and some of the procedures, how I wire one of these cars, and I think we got a resounding yes. So today what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through some of the tools that I use, and some of these tools are just hand-me-down tools from my construction business. They're tools that I can no longer carry on my work truck, but work perfectly fine here in the shop. And then others are specific tools that stay here in the shop, like, you know, my weather pack tools. So come right back and we'll dive in and we'll talk about the tools and some of the procedures that I go through to get one of these cars wired. All right, I had to put my glasses on and see what I was doing. So wiring. I'm going to start off with the debate because I know we're going to get to it at some point. Solder or crimp? And the most direct answer is both. And you're going to get positives and negatives from, you know, all kinds of different people on which is best. I don't care which is best. I care which is going to work in the situation that I'm dealing with. And so sometimes that situation is going to call for soldering and heat shrink. Other times it's going to call for a solderless connector, which is a crimp connector. So I don't think there's one answer for every situation. So we'll get into that in a little bit, but what I want to start with is the different types of crimp connectors that we use here in the shop. All right, when it comes to crimp connectors, in the trade we call them stake-ons. There are insulated and non-insulated. Now in the trades, it's very rare for us to use a non-insulated crimp connector. And that's primarily because most of the voltages that we're working with they're usually 120 volts or 110 volts and up. And so they lend themselves more to an insulated connector than they do to a non-insulated connector, and that's just kind of the way it is. But when you're dealing with low voltage, you're dealing with 24 volts, 12 volts, 6 volts even, 5 volts, you know, some of the stuff is 5 volts like a USB connector. Solderless uninsulated connectors are the choice because what you can do is then you can add heat shrink tubing over the actual connection, and then the point of contact stays nice and clean so that it makes a really good connection. So let's look at both of them here. So here's an example of a number 12/number 10 solderless connector in both an insulated, which is the yellow, and the non-insulated, which is the bare. It's like a aluminum alloy is what these connectors are made out of. Now, in a situation like this, where I'm doing, like, just as a for instance, the connector for the fan. Remember, we're using a Ford style cooling fan on this, which is a 2-speed fan. It's a high amperage fan. We're using the equivalent of what is a number 10 wire to feed the fan and for the ground. So you can see our ground connector right here. Now, you can see on this connector, I used a non-insulated connector, and then I've got heat shrink tubing on the outside. The reason that I'm using a non-insulated connector on there is just because of the bulk. You can see, like, by the time I would put this connector on and then add heat shrink tubing to the outside, which I generally always do, it's going to get big. It's going to get to a point where it may not fit in the split loom that you're using in order to cover all your wires. Now you might ask, well, why are you putting heat shrink tubing on the outside? Well, I like the security it gives me. In most cases, I'm using heat shrink tubing that has an adhesive inside of it, especially in the engine compartment where stuff is going to be exposed to moisture, road debris, and all that kind of stuff. And so when you're using a self-adhesive type heat shrink tubing, it kind of bonds everything together. It's one extra layer of protection so that that connection never comes undone. So what I do in an instance like that, where it's at like a number 10 or a number 12 wire, is I'll use a non-insulated connector, and you can see by the time we add heat shrink tubing to this, it's actually smaller than a connector that has the insulation already on it. And like I said, you can pick these things up. So here's some, I think these are Stay-On connectors. And there's different quality of connectors too. You know, I like the 3M or Scotch brand. So there's a number 10, number 12. This is a female spade connector. And these are high quality connectors. So you can use these not only in your car, but you can use these for high voltage applications up to, I think, 600 volts. I'd have to look at the nomenclature on the box. But we use those in the commercial construction industry all the time because my background in electrical was in commercial refrigeration controls and stuff like that for supermarkets. And so we used just a shit ton of Stay-On connectors like those. So those are good quality connectors. These are the same brand connector, but you can see they're uninsulated. So these are ring connectors. And they crimp the exact same way. And I'll get into the proper way to crimp these in just a minute. But a properly crimped connector should last the lifetime of whatever it's going into. So if you're putting this in a car and you crimp it properly, it should last the life of the car. If you're using it in a commercial application, it should last for the entirety of that commercial application. So there's the insulated and non-insulated connector. All right, so how do you properly crimp a insulated or non-insulated solderless connector? Now, if you look at these tools, and these are by far the best tool that I've ever used for Stay-On connectors or solderless connectors. These are made by a company called T&B, and you can see this set of tool, or this tool itself, is probably 30 or maybe even 35 years old. I got these when I first got into the trade. A fellow electrician that I was working with had a set of these, and he gifted me a pair. I don't remember if it was for one of my birthdays or something like that, but he gifted me this pair of T&B. It's a multi-tool, but I primarily use it for crimping. And it does a number of things. You can see it has a stripper right here, but what I found is it's very inconvenient to strip on the bottom leg of a tool. I like to strip out here on the end, and we'll get to that in a minute. But this also has a screw cutter in it. So you can cut screws from 4-40 all the way to 1024 and 1032. So everything through there, you can insert the screw, put it at the length you want, and cut the screw. And it does a really good job of blunting the end of the screw so that it doesn't mess up the threads, and you'll be able to just screw that screw in just as if it came off the production line. So here's the proper way to crimp. And I'm going to go against the grain and against what the actual tool said. You can see here where it says insole, that means insulated, and then non-insole. And so what the tool manufacturer is telling you is that when you use an insulated connector like this, this tool should be in this position, and you should crimp it in that area where the domed portion of the tool is to crimp this connector. I disagree. I've had far too many, and I learned this when I first got in the trade. I've had far too many crimps where I crimped it down in that position and the connector would still pull loose. So what I went to long ago is using the pin section of the tool to crimp both insulated and non-insulated crimp connects. Now, I'm going to use this butt connector as an example, but if you look at most butt connectors like this, you're going to see there's no seam in it. So it doesn't really matter where you crimp this, meaning you don't have to worry about the seam splitting open if you crimp this in the wrong spot. But if you look at the ring connector has a seam on the top. So I don't know if this camera will focus in on that, but it has a seam, and it's right here on the top, right where my fingernail is. So there's a seam that runs down there. If you put the pin portion of this tool in that area where that seam is, and the nice thing about these connectors is it's a serrated seam. So it's not just a straight seam like some of the cheaper connectors. But if you put that pin in that position, what you're going to find is it's going to open the actual connector up. It's not going to crimp it properly. So the school of thought on a connector is that you're always going to put this pin portion of the tool on the back side of the crimp. So let me get the camera set up and I'm going to show you exactly what I'm talking about. All right, so on this connector, it just as a for instance, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the pin, which is right here, and I'm going to put it on the back side of the connector, and I'm going to tighten it down. Now let me grab a piece of wire, we'll put it in there, and we'll show you exactly how this crimp is going to work. All right, so we've got the connector, we've got the back side of the connector where the pin is going to go in, and then we're going to crimp these. So you can see what it does in the front is it kind of holds the piece down and almost makes it dome shaped so that it doesn't want to split open. But on the back side, it makes a recess where the pin goes in, and it pushes all those strands of the wire both out towards that dome section of the tool and out, so that there's really no way, I'm pulling pretty hard, there's no way this piece is going to come out of there. And then what you're going to do is you're going to take some of that adhesive-backed shrink tubing, you're going to put it over this, and you're going to go ahead and use your heat gun to shrink the tubing. Now, the exposed portion of the ring terminal is all exposed so that it can sit flat and make good contact with whatever it's going to connect to. All right, since we're dealing with what is number 12 wire anyways, let's go ahead and put another connector on. This time we'll use an insulated connector. We're going to run the wire so it's just sticking out the end of the connector so it's just visible. We'll take the pin side of the tool, put it on the back side, and we'll go ahead and crimp that down. You can see it did the same thing. It domed the front of the connector, which is holding all of the strands and what have you, even the connector for that matter, the seam of the connector together. And the pin went in from the back and pushed the wires forward and out. So again, this connector is not going to come off. But you can see that with the insulation on the outside, it's going to be much bigger if you go ahead and put some heat shrink tubing over the top of it. Now, one other thing to mention is that you got to be careful where on the connector you're crimping. Not just where the pin is going to engage the connector, but where on the connector you're actually crimping. So, as a for instance, if you look inside this connector, there's a portion of the back side here where there is no metal. And that's just basically like a cuff or a collar. So all of your crimping is going to be happening between where that cuff ends and where the insulation ends. And you want to be pretty close to the center of that portion so that on both sides of where your crimp connection ends up being, there is enough metal so that it's not going to want to pull out. Meaning if you crimp it way out here at the end, now you've only got a portion it's actually crimped. And if you in turn crimp it way up on the neck of the connector, you're going to have the same issue. You're going to only be crimping it or holding it in at the very end of the connector. So it's important that you find the center of where the metal portion of the collar is and crimp down on that section of the connector. All right, let's talk about some of the other tools that I use when I'm wiring a car. We've already gone over the set of TMB crimp connectors that I use here at the shop, but I'm going to caution you guys against using one of the sets that you could find at your local auto parts store. Now, I didn't buy these from an auto parts store. I bought these from a home center, and it was one of those kind of in a pinch type of purchases. I needed a screw cutter, and my TMB pliers weren't on the truck because they spend more time here in the shop. I have since put a pair of screw cutters on the truck. That's the pair I'm going to show you here. So I picked these up at I think Lowe's was the company that was selling Gardner Bender tools at the time. You can see it has a lot of the same functions as the TMB connector. So there's a wire stripper here at the bottom. There is a non-insulated and insulated set of crimping dies. However, because of where this set of dies is that have the pin in them, you just don't get the same amount of leverage as if they were out here on the end like the TMB. So although you can use these, it takes far more effort to get a good crimp out of one of these pair of crimpers than it does the TMB crimpers. Now, I will tell you, there are other crimpers made by like Klein Tools, Ideal Tools, where they have a pin style crimper on the end of the tool. The issue that I have with them is that the crimping die is much wider. Now, that could be good, it could be bad. I like the dimple that the TMBs make because it's a nice, precise pin penetration that I can get right in the center of the connector. As I told you, it's really important where you crimp them on the connector. With the wider sets, like I have a set that is made by, I think, Klein Tools, because the crimping die is so wide, when you go to crimp that thing down, it crimps the entire portion of that connector. And my feeling on that is it doesn't give you the same quality of a crimp. It works. I've used them when it's the only tool that's in my pouch at work, but I prefer my TMBs. And this is not a paid endorsement for Thomas & Betts. I just like that tool, and because I've become so accustomed to it, that's why I lean towards that tool every time I need to make a crimp. So moving on, you're gonna need some type of stripper. Not the one that dances on a pole, but one that strips your wires. And because I've, again, been in the trades for 30 plus years, these are the style that I use. Now, I've used just about every brand. I've used Klein, I've used Ideal. Ideal's probably my favorite set. I've used Gardner Bender. I've used, oh, what's the other one that I have? I've got an orange pair on my truck now. Oh, I can't remember the name of them. But I like this style. Now, the reason that this set made it into my arsenal here in the shop is that because I don't like this pliers type serrated edge on the tool for my primary strippers for work, like when I'm doing electrical work out in the field. When I bought these, I used them for a couple days, and what kept happening every time I was stripping wires is I kept getting my finger caught in the end and pinching my finger. And it's probably just me in the way that I strip wires, but it became something that I just didn't feel like dealing with, and so I got myself another set of Ideal strippers for my work truck, and that's what I use on the work truck. These made it into the shop because they have this serrated edge, and when I'm stripping wires for one of the car builds, the wires are generally much smaller, and so I hold the strippers in a different way to strip smaller wires, and so then I don't get my finger caught up here in the end and pinch my fingers. Now I think I've got a set of Ideals over here. No, these are Gardner Bender. So the nice thing about the Ideal strippers is that area on the end is meant for bending hooks and wires. And so one, it's smooth, and two, it doesn't come to full contact when the tool is depressed all the way, because it's designed to go around 14 gauge and 12 gauge wires in order to make a loop on it. So I don't get my fingers caught in the end of them. And you can see my fingers are quite large. That's probably the reason that it's a little bit cumbersome for me to use a tool that has those plier end to them when I'm stripping wires. And so I just choose not to use those out in the field. I use the Ideal strippers, and I've just found that they work the best for me. Now, the ones that I have on my truck are the style of the Ideal strippers, but they're a different brand. They've got orange handles, and again, I can't remember the name of them. So, but they work, Woods tools. And so I've got a pair of Woods strippers on my truck right now, and they are a clone of the Ideal strippers. They work great. The Klein Tools strippers are made very similar to the Ideal, we call them T-strippers. And they have the same type of end on them, so that you can, I think the Klein, you can get with or without the pliers type end on them, but I prefer the ones that don't have it. So enough about strippers. You're going to need a good set of diagonal cutters as well. So all a pair of diagonal cutters is going to do is it's just going to cut bulk wire to length. And you know, they're also useful in cutting tie wraps that you use temporarily. So I use a lot of tie wraps. I buy my tie wraps in bulk. I buy them by the 1,000. And when you buy them like that, they're pretty much, you know, inconsequential as far as cost. So I don't have a problem tying stuff up with tie wraps and then cutting them loose and throwing them away and starting again, because it's a necessary cost in building the car. It's just something I kind of figure in, because I know I'm going to cut, you know, 30, 50, maybe 100 of those tie wraps loose and throw them away during a build, and they don't cost all that much money, but they will hold something in place short term until I get an actual P-clip or a cushion clip in place to hold that bunch of wires in place for the long term. So this pair made it into my shop because I hate the fact that the insulated handles are always working themselves loose. It seemed like a really good deal at the time. I was at the home center. They were on sale. You can see these are made by DeWalt. They haven't seen much use. They will cut the diagonal cutting portion of them, will cut just about anything. I've cut up to, I think, 1/4 20 machine screws with these, and they're still sharp. But the handles always coming loose became an issue. Oh, and they don't, because of the way the head is shaped, they don't fit into my side pouch, the tool bag that I wear at work, really well. They have a very squared edge, and they're always getting caught in the pocket that they go in, and so it became very inconvenient to use them at work. And so these quickly made it into the drawer here in the shop because they just became a nuisance at work. But here in the shop they work great because I store them in a drawer. I also have a pair of what look like Klein side cutters, but they are actually from Harbor Freight. Harbor Freight's brand Doyle. They have come out with a set of tools that very much mimics the tools that I have from Klein Tools. And when I first got into the trade, I was 16 or 17 years old. And my first set of tools were all Klein Tools. And back then, you could get a pair of side cutters for $9. Now, I'm aging myself. But that same pair of side cutters now from Klein, even if I was to buy them at a wholesale house, they're upwards of $30. And that's a lot of money, you know, especially if you misplace them. And I just found that there are other alternatives out there that are far less expensive and that work just as good. This pair of side cutters from Doyle, from Harbor Freight, is every bit the tool that I use with the Klein Tool name on them. And I've gone to buying these. They're about $13 last time I bought a pair from Harbor Freight. So you can see they're about a third the cost of the Klein Tool. But like I said, they operate and they work just as well in my experience. So I've gone to using these. There are some things that I just won't substitute. My lineman's pliers that I use in my toolkit at work, I continue to use Klein Tools because of the versatility. They have a tape puller in them. They do have a stake-on crimper in them. And so in a pinch, I can use that. My needle nose pliers, my large 8-inch needle nose pliers, same thing. I will only buy those from Klein Tools because they have the necessary tools kind of advantage to them where they have extra things added to them that I use all the time. And I'm just not willing to sacrifice on those. But for side cutters, these ones from Doyle, they're a pretty good option. And like I said, they're about the third the cost. So those are some of the tools that you're going to need to do just general electrical on your car, general wiring. Now let's get into some of the specialty tools. All right, I found two pair of Ideal T-strippers on in one of the drawers here, and so I wanted to show you the difference. So we looked at these Cobalt tools. Again, they're mirrored after the Ideal tools, but you can see on the end here, it's got this serrated edge, right? And that's the problem that I have with these, is that serrated end always seems to catch my finger. So if you look at the Klein tools right here, you can see they've got an indent there at the end, but when they come together, they don't come flush. So it won't pinch your finger like the ones that I got from Cobalt. And the same thing with this pair right here. Now the difference between these is that the yellow ones here are made for solid wire. Now you can use them for solid or stranded, it really doesn't matter. But there are differences in the diameter of the dies here to strip the wire. And then the red pair here is strictly for stranded wire. And the recesses in the dies for the different size wires is different. So like on here, the 16 gauge wire is all the way here at the neck of the tool, and on the solid wire, that one is all the way at the end, and it actually goes down to 18 gauge. So this is why I really like the T-strippers better than the ones that have the plier type end on the end of them. But these are both you know, a really old pair of Ideal T-strippers, and you know, to the point where the cutting edge right here, where you would cut wire, is really dull. It still strips wire just fine. But once they get to this point, I really can't use them at work because it becomes an issue where I'm spending more time cutting and stripping wires than I should be, and it's just more advantageous to go out and buy a new pair of strippers rather than fuss with an old pair that's dull. So I wanted to show you those before we move on to some of the specialty tools. I think I mentioned this before. I loaned out my WeatherPack connectors to someone, and I honestly forgot who it was. And I think at the same time I loaned them my pin release tools. Now, I had spent quite a bit of money, probably $80 to $100 on a set of WeatherPack crimpers, and they were the ratcheting type, and really nice set. And the pin release tool that I have was a smaller set than I have now, but it was just a better quality. The you know, you can tell a quality tool when you hold it in your hand, but I'm still hoping that at some point whoever I loan them to will remember that they're mine and say, hey, you know what, Frank, I got your tools here. I'd really like to return them, but for the life of me, I can't remember who I loaned them to. And one of the reasons I don't loan a whole lot of tools out anymore. But I did have to replace my WeatherPack crimping tools. And so when I did, I only spent like $18, $20. I think I bought these on eBay, and I bought a larger set of pin release tools. Now, these pin release tools will work on a number of different connectors, not just WeatherPack connectors. So what I'm telling you is that if you order a set, you can order a really inexpensive set from Amazon or from eBay, but just make sure you get the most complete set of pin release tools that are out there, with as many different types of pin release tools included, so that you don't find out that the one pin release that you need is missing. So these are the tools that are used for both crimping and releasing WeatherPack connectors. And as I said, this set right here, the set I got has 5 key rings, basically like this, of different pin release tools. So you can see there's just all different types, but I found that the ones that I use the most for WeatherPack connectors are the ones that are kind of like this. They're a single blade that goes in and just pushes down the pin so that the pin that is inside will release, and then the connector will come apart. So get yourself a set of these. I think you can probably get a really complete set of these for under $20 on Amazon or eBay. And then the WeatherPack tool that I got here is, for me it's a really good tool because I know how to use it, and I'm not saying that other people don't know how to use tools. What I'm saying is that this tool right here, you actually have to make sure that you're in the right section of the tool for whatever the operation that you're doing. So if you're crimping the actual pin or the actual connector, you need to make sure that you're within the wire range and within the connector range that you're crimping. So in this case, it's a 14 to a 16 gauge wire. Up here, it's between a 22 and a 24 gauge wire. Here, it's between a 20 and an 18 gauge wire. So those are 3 pins right there that take care of just about every connector that you're going to need to do for WeatherPacks. And then the other openings on here are for the seal. So this one is for the larger seals. This one is for the smaller seals. And you can see they open up, they're spring loaded, and then, you know, they're smooth in the way they work. The tool that I had before had a single die for basically any WeatherPack connector, and the tool itself was adjustable. So if you were doing a number of different one size of connectors, you basically put it in that setting, it was ratcheting, you clamped it down, and it stopped where it needed to stop. It was the same thing with the seals. I have to put a little more effort into this one because I have to think about what size crimp I'm doing every time and what size seal. But if you're only going to build one car, or you're only going to build a couple of cars, or you're not building cars all the time, a set like this will actually work really well for WeatherPack connectors. And I use this set exclusively since I lost my other pair. So that'll tell you, they work well enough that I haven't wanted to invest in another set of the good pair that I had before. Since we're talking about WeatherPack connectors, I figured I'd show you WeatherPack connector kit, and right now I'm getting these from a guy on eBay, and the guy is great. His communication is great. He makes custom sets for me. So just as a for instance, when I started buying kits from him, his kits are listed, you know, as assortments. So in that assortment, you'll get like, you know, 6 single pin connectors, 4 double pin connectors, and however many 3-pin connectors. And I think he sells everything all the way up to like 6 or maybe 8-pin connectors. So you can get any number of connectors from him, and they're reasonable. So one of the kits that I have here is right around $50 to $60. What I've done recently is, because I'm pretty much exclusively using 3-pin connectors in the car, and when I'm using anything odd, what I'll do is I'll call him up and he'll just send me, you know, 4 of whatever, however many connectors I need. and all of the pins and seals in order to make the connectors work. But this is kind of an assortment that I got from him a while back, and you can see there's different connectors in here. There's obviously some 3-pin connectors. We've got some 4-pin connectors. I think I've got a single pin connector in here. You know, I've got them in you know, and the connectors obviously are both male and female connectors. And every kit he sells, as far as the assortments, will come with a pin release tool. So this pin release tool will work on every one of the connectors that's in this kit. And then he gives you different size seals, and you can see I've got an assortment of male and female pins to go with the kit. So like I said, I get these from him, and he generally will include like an assortment in the general scheme of things. So for instance, here's you know, kind of what he gives you. He'll give you 5 of the single pin connectors, both the male and the female, which they call shrouds and towers. 2 conductors, he'll give you like maybe 6 of those. And then the 3 conductors, he'll give you a number of those. And then you get all the different terminals and all the different size seals. You'll also get some plugs in there. So the plugs are for when you've got, let's say you're using a 3-pin connector, but you're only using 2 of the pins. You can put a plug in each one of the open slots that you're not using, and that'll keep it weather tight. So really, really good vendor to buy from. I'm hoping to get Mike Forte to maybe put together a kit for guys that are building cars. And it'll be more geared towards your specific build. So if you're building a coupe and we know you need, you know, this amount of 3-pin connectors and this amount of 2-pin connectors, you know, Mike can provide you a kit with that. I haven't talked to Mike about this. I don't know if he's open to that idea, but I just thought this would be something that he could sell, and he could also sell you know, a mid-range or inexpensive set of crimping pliers to go along with it. Now, the last time I ordered from this guy, you can see I haven't even opened the package up. It's still taped shut. I had him put together a 3-pin exclusive kit. And I told him that I only needed the gray seals. And I told him that I only used a basically the 14 gauge terminals. And so he put together a custom kit for me. This kit with all those connectors cost the same as that assorted kit. He charged me the exact same price. That's a deal. And I'll probably put a link to probably the assortment on in the description of the video, and you guys can check it out. But for $60, even this kit, the assorted kit, works perfectly. What you can do is you can use the 3-pin connectors like in the back of the car and for the headlights, and then at the front marker lights you can use a combination of the 2-pin and the single-pin connectors. That way you don't get the connectors mixed up either when you put anything together. But as you can see, as I go through the car, I use these connectors in other places, behind the dash as a for instance. And so it's nice to have some extra connectors in case you find someplace in the car where you want to add a weather pack connector to the wiring harness where it doesn't already have one. So there's the weather packs. I think we'll move on to soldering and soldering tools next. All right, as I said earlier, there are places in the car where you're going to want to solder. I'm not going to tell you where those spaces are or where they should be, but my opinion on it is that anywhere where a crimp connector doesn't make sense is the best spot to use solder. Whether that is extending a wire that's too short, or whether it's in a spot that you don't ever want to get to if a crimp connector were to come apart. Now, again, if you crimp it properly, it won't ever come apart. There are those instances where stuff happens and, you know, something works loose. So I like to use solder and soldered connections wherever I'm not going to be able to get to something later on. Whether that's, underneath the car in the transmission tunnel, in the engine compartment in an area where it's just not feasible to get in, behind the dash, in an area where it's really difficult to get to, like maybe around or behind a heater, in the foot box where, there may or may not be a removable panel where you get to a connector later on. So there are places to use solder. I generally, after I crimp every weather pack connector, I put a dab of solder on. And that's just a habit that I've got into when I first started building cars. It's kind of a belt and suspenders approach to things, to where if the crimp were ever to open up, the solder's going to hold it in place. So I know the arguments about solder. There are good places and bad places to use solder, but my opinion is that in most instances, it's not going to hurt. Now, these are both Weller soldering irons. This one has the Sears name on it, so you can tell it's got some age because Sears isn't even around anymore. But what I'm going to tell you is, when you're looking at a soldering iron, and I prefer an iron over a gun. I don't like to wait for a gun to heat up, even though they tend to heat up fast. I just found that the guns are much more cumbersome. They kind of get in your way. Where with an iron, I can set it on, a soldering iron stand, and grab it when I need it and put it back out of my way when I don't. And it stays hot the entire time it's plugged in. Now that has its downside too, because you don't want to leave it plugged in your shop and forget about it, go in for the evening, and then your soldering iron's going all night. I've just gotten the habit of, whenever I leave the shop each afternoon or evening, I unplug every extension cord that I've used during the day. And that serves me well, because that way nothing gets left on. The only exception to that is maybe a battery charger, if I'm charging a battery. So I try to unplug every cord that I plug in during the day before I leave the shop every night. Now, I'm gonna recommend to you that you get the highest wattage soldering iron that is feasible. So for instance, this is probably only, I don't even know how many watts it is. I'd have to look at it. This is a 30 watt soldering iron. It's one that you're going to find like at your local home center, and it'll work. The problem is it doesn't melt the solder as quickly as something that's higher wattage like this one. And this one's so old, I don't even know what the wattage is on it. Let me see if I can read this. It says Weller SP80. So it's probably an 80 watt. I'm trying to see if I can see the part number, SP80, but I can't see any wattage on it. So let's just say it's, maybe 80 to 100 watts versus the 30 watts of the smaller one. It makes all the difference in the world. Now, I have a Black Beauty soldering iron too that I got from one of my old neighbors. And it was brand new in the package. It's probably from the 40s because it has a cloth cord on it. And that thing works extremely well. The problem is it's much bigger than the Weller that I've gone to using now. And the Weller just gets in places where the Black Beauty it doesn't fit. And the Black Beauty is so heavy that the soldering iron stand that I have wouldn't hold its weight. It kept collapsing. And so half the time I'd end up having the soldering iron on the floor instead of on the stand. And so I just got away from using it for the car builds because it started getting in the way. But as I said, get one that is a higher wattage, so that basically as soon as you touch the wire, and when you solder, you're not heating the solder, you're heating the wire. So what I do is I always heat the bottom of the wire. So whatever the bottom portion of the wire is, that's where I bring the soldering iron up to, and I feed my solder in from the top. Solder is always drawn to heat. So if you do it that way, then you're not trying to push the solder up. The solder is going to be drawn down towards the iron. It's going to be drawn towards the heat. And so you're going to get a better connection. You're going to solder better by doing it that way. Now there are some places that you just can't do that. You can't get the soldering iron in from the bottom. And so you're going to have to get the soldering iron kind of, anywhere you can, whether it's the side, the top, or wherever, and then you're going to have to feed the solder in from the opposite side. It's not the end of the world, but I just found that it's better for me if I can get the soldering iron in from the bottom to heat the wire from the bottom up and draw the solder in from the top. It just makes a really good connection. Solder. This is not like sweating copper pipes. So you're going to want to make your soldering as easy as you possibly can. So make sure that you're always using a rosin core solder. Some places will list it as electrical solder, and that just means that it has a certain amount of flux in it, and then it has a particular alloy. So none of the solders anymore have lead, but this one's a 60-40. What you're going to find is that plumbing solder is a different alloy, and then it requires you to use a separate soldering paste flux in order to draw the solder in. It gets really messy. So make sure you get a nice quality rosin core solder. I picked this up from a local supplier, and I think this is a 3 or a 5 pound. I'm trying to see if it says. It doesn't say how many pounds it is. It just gives the length. But I think it's a 5 pound roll. It might be a 3 pound roll. And that way I'm never like having to run out last minute. I know long before I run out that I need to go out and get solder. So rosin core solder for electrical, and you're going to be good to go. The last thing that I'm going to tell you about soldering is that most of the wires that you're going to solder, although they may be the same gauge wire, are going to be different strand thickness. So just as a for instance, the Ron Francis harness that's in these cars, the wiring does not have a really high strand count. The wires may be an 18 gauge, a 14 gauge, a 16 gauge. However, the strand count on them is much lower than a lot of the wire that I buy particularly. I always look for something that has a very high strand count, because the higher the amount of strands that are in the copper wiring, the better conductivity it has, the less apt it is to heat up, and it makes it easier with a high strand count to solder. So what I'm going to tell you is, if you were in a situation where you were soldering the same size wire, so let's just use 14 gauge wire as a for instance, 14 gauge to 14 gauge, and your chassis harness has, let's say it's a 7 or an 8 strand, and the wire that you're using to lengthen or tie onto that wiring has a 12 or a 14 strand, always wrap the thinner, higher strand count wire around the outside of the lower strand count, thicker wire. The reason for that is that you're going to be able to solder without having to use some type of other device, or one of these little alligator clip holders to hold those wires in place while you're soldering. Always strip your wires that are going to wrap around in your wire soldering condition. Whatever wires you're going to wrap around the other, make them a little bit longer where you strip them, and so you'll have a little bit more wire to wrap around the outside, and that'll hold them in place so that, again, you're not fighting them trying to get them soldered together. And then if you use the procedure that I told you to solder, where you heat from the bottom and feed your solder from the top, the solder will be drawn towards the heat, towards the soldering iron, and you'll get full penetration of the solder into the connection. The last thing I want to tell you is that, just like when you flare brake lines, always make sure you put your shrink tubing over the wire before you solder. Slide it up and out of the way so you don't heat the shrink tubing as you're heating the solder, but always put it on first, because if you put a connector, you put a stake-on connector on the end and then try to add it later, you're going to end up cutting that connector off to slide the heat shrink tubing all the way up the wire in order to get it on. So think about what needs to happen before you solder and get that done. So if you're going to put heat shrink tubing over the soldered connection, make sure you put that on beforehand, slide it up and out of the way, solder your connection, and then once it cools, bring the shrink tubing over the connection and then shrink the tubing. Same holds true for connectors when you put stake-on connectors on the end. Make sure you add the shrink tubing before you crimp the connector on, because otherwise you're cutting that connector off. Because most of the shrink tubing out there, about the most shrinkage you're going to get is 3-to-1. And most times that connector is going to be bigger than the 3-to-1, and so you're not going to be able to get that shrink tubing to shrink down small enough and be able to get it over the head of the connector. So make sure you put your shrink tubing on first, and then make sure you size your shrink tubing properly when you're using it as well, because you don't want something that's too small, you don't want something that's too big. You want to be within the wire range that is on the shrink tubing container. So keep all that in mind. All right, everybody, this may not be everything inclusive for doing the wiring in your project, but I covered a lot of ground. If I missed something that you think is important, put it down in the comments and maybe I'll include it in another video. I don't do a whole lot of these tool videos anymore. They generally don't do well, but as I've told you before, I'm not really worried about the views. I'm doing this to help those of you that are building the cars kind of have a better idea of what it takes in order to get your project completed. And that's far more important than the views to me. So if I forgot something that you think is important, again, put it in the comments and I'll try to cover it in another video. I do have another tool video coming up in a couple of weeks. I just purchased a couple of tools to repair tools that I already have, and so I'll probably include that in a video as well. But for now, I think that's going to do it. If you're enjoying the content here, as always, please do the like, the share, the subscribe, all that kind of stuff. We'll see you next time. Have a great day.